Hello, and welcome to the latest entry in Hagley History Hangout. Hagley History Hangout is a program presented by the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. This program centers on the latest research and publications coming out of Hagley's collections. On this week's entry, I'm interviewing Dr. Katina Manko on her recent book, Ding Dong Calling, or excuse me, Ding Dong, Avon Calling, The Women and Men of Avon Products Incorporated. So, got my copy right here. So, what drew you to this, or before we get into that, can you give us a bit of an overview about what your book is about?
Oh, yes, of course.
Oh, and introduce yourself too, of course. I'm sorry, I'm so eager to get into it.
Thank you. Um, well, I'm Katina Manko, and I guess I should preface it by saying that way back when I was a graduate student, I was a Hagley Fellow. So this is a book that not only comes out of the Hagley archives, but out of the University of Delaware and the Hagley program at the time. And so this came from a dissertation topic that I had developed through as a Hagley Fellow, which is kind of neat. So Ding Dong Avon Calling is a history of the Avon Corporation. And as a history of the Avon Corporation, it's both about how the company developed and how it was managed. But Avon ladies are another kind of interesting layer of business owners in that they are all independent contractors. And so technically they own their own business under the umbrella of Avon. So it's a book that tries to be about this conversation, this marriage between these two very different types of and uneven types of business owners, between the big box, this multi-billion-dollar corporation, and then all of these millions of small business owners who were Avon ladies.
How did you arrive at your interest in this topic?
By accident. Well, not quite by accident, but I had wanted to study women in business as a graduate student, and most everything that we were studying was about women as laborers or women as consumers. Women who worked for corporations or worked with different types of technologies, and as laborers that was very important. But I wanted to know more about women in middle management, and I wanted to know more about women as business owners. So initially, Ding Dong Avon Calling was going to be a book that was about Avon ladies and fuller brush men. I was thinking very much 1950s, 1930s. And I thought there would be a neat juxtaposition of corporate archives, that you could have the Avon Corporation that contracted almost wholly with women, and the Fuller Brush archives. Now at the time, I've since learned that they have been located and they're at the Smithsonian. However, at the time, I couldn't put the two of them together. And so in the interest of expediency, I shifted everything over to Avon. But really it was by chance. And Delaware, it was home, Newark, Delaware was home to an Avon distribution plant. And I used to drive by it almost regularly on my way between the University of Delaware and Hagley. And so it just became something that I decided to continue poking at and seeing what was there. And then of course it turned out that there was this massive archive that was just ripe for writing a history.
That's one of the, I've been working all morning for how to phrase this question, so apologies if it's a bit awkward because I've gone back and forth on how I want to say this many times. One of the core issues in your book is how Avon deals with the changing roles of women in business and society. And it seems that there is always a massive amount of contradiction at the heart of the company. How do you navigate that, both like as a researcher and then as a writer, like in how you tell this story.
Oh, I may need you to go back and remind me of where this is heading. I probably should have taken some notes on that. So yeah, Avon is this, I guess any direct sales corporation, any corporation has to deal with this massive contradiction. But for Avon, and when it was called the California Perfume Company, which is from before 1938, essentially its first 50 years, which is quite a long time. Avon was very clear, California Perfume Company, and its founder, maybe I should even speak about it in terms of its founder, David McConnell, because he is really at the core of this philosophy about women in business in the early 20th century. Maybe we can call it the early 20th century, the 1890s through the 1930s. And so he was first and foremost for me this voice, this corporate voice, who was remarkable for not specifically suggesting that while he wanted women to be selling his product, he never like stepped back to justify it in any grand way that in his mind seemed necessary. It seems that as historians, we kind of are looking for how corporations may have wanted to shape a business for women as if being women was really central to what they were doing. And I don't think it was for McConnell. McConnell was looking to recruit women. He used women to recruit. And from the early, both his writing and other people within the corporation, no one seemed to really be suggesting that this was a huge deal, that this was out of the ordinary, that this is something that they had to like explain to the public what they meant. It was very matter of fact. And maybe that comes from the rural nature of how McConnell structured his company. He was not looking in cities. He was not looking in big department stores. He was not contracting with other large corporations. He's not contracting with men in the traveling trades. Instead, he's going for rural housewives. Now, McConnell is himself part of that ruralness. Suffern, New York, where he's from at the time, is a very rural place. I'll be honest, I didn't do a huge amount of research into his personal background. But the women who are in rural economies tend to float into kind of lower stakes business pretty seamlessly. And so for women who were selling to neighbors, who were selling to other households, who were selling to families, women were always part of this kind of informal economy. And that's where I think he tapped into. Now I'm getting a little bit away, and I may need you to remind me of where we were here, because McConnell too, he last is head of this corporation into the 1930s. He's quite elderly at the time he hands it over to his young son. And at that point in the 1930s and 40s, Avon is part of a much bigger corporate world. Even still, Avon does not seem to need a excuse for why they are hiring women and women only. It had become at that point very much part of its corporate culture that women would be selling Avon. And so maybe that's part of how the company kind of just navigates that transition over. Is that what you were asking? Or keep it going, because I know your question kind of like that spanned into the 20th century and then asked me to switch lenses as well.
Yes, that is a very broad-ranging question, because it is also attached to the other thing I was curious about that you did highlight on, is why the rural focus over anywhere else? That seems like it could bring about as many challenges as opportunities for the company.
Absolutely. And again, it is pretty remarkable, because Many brand name companies are selling into urban markets. They're using much more modern advertising. I think one of the things that I noticed and I think stands out throughout the book is Avon is forever behind the times. It's not doing mass marketing. It's not buying ads in magazines. It's not doing any advertising at all. And its distribution method is incredibly inefficient because in order to sell $30 worth of products, they have to wait for a woman like to pull together an order, to get the money, to send it in. They send out tiny, hundreds of thousands of tiny little packages of material at a time when what are we trained to look for in business history in the 20th century? But mass distribution, right? There's no mass distribution here, but it becomes very economical in the sense of what the company is not spending money on. And so it just keeps these kind of personal relationships between traveling agents, the women who recruit, the women who are selling, and their customer base, and uses a kind of a post office style communication to keep things moving. And they make money at it. It does not follow a model that I've seen anywhere else in business history for in the 20th century.
It seems almost as if they're making a deliberate choice to place the development of interpersonal relationships above virtually everything else.
Yes, I think that's exactly right.
And was that sort of, I kind of hesitate to use this phrasing, but was that a deliberate choice to empower women on the part of the company?
I don't know. It did. It had that effect. But there's nothing that's overtly political that you would label as feminist in their literature. The women who do the recruiting, who become kind of the mid-level managers for the corporation, they're very conscious about what they need and what their options are. Many of them are single, many of them are widows. The women who are doing the recruiting and who can end up with really nice salaries for themselves, but at a cost, at a cost of being away from home 6, 8, 10 months a year. They like that adventure. And the women who are very forward about that, right? I don't think they put it though into a much bigger political trajectory. Like I said, the feminism is there and it's underneath, but it's not overt. They're not trying to make a statement beyond kind of an acceptance, a tacit acceptance that women can be empowered through earning cash, right? That women need money, they need earning opportunities, they need to be able to balance their homes, their families, and they need income, and here we can help provide it, and we're going to find you if we can.
It seems really funny to me that they never seriously considered that, given that it seems, at least with the benefit of hindsight, fairly obvious that they're sowing a lot of seeds there to push for, well, the eventual rise of women within the company.
Yeah.
I'm especially thinking about, to move us into mid-century for this, is I think it was in 1935 that they started to permanently settle some of the traveling agents and have them establish their own offices. Like, how, just reading that, it seemed fairly obvious to me that eventually these women are going to want to move up higher, since you're giving them the opportunity to earn more money and geographic stability.
I think they really have a two-tier system in mind, because there's the men at the home office and in the headquarters who organize the campaigns, the sales campaigns, who organize the manufacturing of product and the distribution networks. And then there's the women in the city offices who are training the representative staff. And I think they see those as so separate that the women who are organizing the city offices are brought in only as guests into headquarters occasionally. And it's just not a career path that's on their radar. It really won't be until the 1970s that Avon will start to think more carefully about women at headquarters. So again, that two-tier system of the business. There's the headquarters and home office business, and then there's the millions of women who are the independent businesses. And so the city's sales managers who train all of those representatives are working for the corporation, but they're also in that halfway point of getting some commission. They get bonuses based on how well their office is doing. And maybe the geographical distance matters, that, you know, women in cities in Pasadena where, you know, Avon headquarters isn't located, helps the men at Avon keep those business tracks separate. But they really do see the management of the company as something that men do, and then the management of the sales staff as something that women do.
So is this almost another extension of independent contractors versus regular employees then, since anybody on a commission seems to be on a totally different track, even though it seems like they're in both tracks realistically.
Yeah,
so to speak.
the women in the city offices are definitely on both tracks, and they're more corporate than they are independent contractor. But there just doesn't seem the opportunity for crossover that someone in a small city in, we'll say Dayton, Ohio, just to name a small Midwestern city, is they're not expecting her to pick up everything and move to New York or Morton Grove or anything like that. That they see them as like, this is where you live and this is where your business is. So those women in the city offices are there. Although, you know, hey, that said, you know, for the 1930s and 40s, they were moving city office managers around as well, taking into account their family situations. Are you married? Do you have children? Can you travel? And they were quick to move some of those more mobile women around to help set up city offices. The men of Avon, I was just reading through, kind of looking through my papers. There was a memoir of a woman named Anna Figsby, who started off as an accounting clerk in the 1890s with the California Perfume Company and stayed there through the 1950s. So she had a very long career. And what struck me for Anna Figsby was that the way that she introduced the men who would become the corporate leaders of the 1940s and 50s, even the 1930s, as they started to play with advertising. And Avon was known as a company, as I think a lot of companies were, that took in young men. So John Ewald, who will be the president and CEO of the company in the 1950s, begins as an 18-year-old office clerk. And so she describes him sitting there like this 18-year-old kid sitting, watching the back of his head and how intent he was and everything he wanted to learn. And when you look at the corporate officers of Avon in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, you see men who had started there as young kids, fresh out of, well, I was going to say high school, but they might not have been. High schools really weren't invented yet. But you know, that they took young and they kept them with the company for a very long time. So I guess it's just to say as a balance of why aren't women coming in from the outside? Well, because Avon also has a culture of promoting its men from within as well, from being young.
And again, is that a deliberate choice of corporate culture?
Yeah, very clearly so. Very clearly so. Especially when Moncanon was in life, he had this sense of values of how you treated each other and how the company would treat its employees and how it would treat its representatives. And that paternalism of raising a corporate man was very clear for him.
Earlier you talked about Avon seeming to be perpetually a bit behind the times. Do you think some of that could possibly stem from just the sheer amount of time McConnell Sr. spent at the head of the company?
Oh, could be. Yeah,
he
he was very
spanned.
conservative. He didn't take a lot of risks. It was his son who wanted to open city offices, and they were very uncertain about how to do that.
And his son only ran the company quite briefly before Ewald took over,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, he died early. I
Hmm.
think he lived a very happy life.
Uh, so as we, keep barreling through the 20th century here, what do you think is the next logical place to go? Avon opening up sales representative positions to women of color, or going right to well, let's talk about that first.
Of the 1960s,
Yeah.
50s, 60s. Yeah, I mean, uh, Avon is very uh, self-conscious about looking for white women, although kind of like with feminism, they don't say it outright. They have a few policies in the 1940s, 30s that talk about not recruiting representatives in Black neighborhoods, that they had some policies of if a African American woman was recruited, that she couldn't purchase on credit. So her customers had to pay for their orders up front, as opposed to white customers who put in an order and then would pay for it when they got it. Um, but it's in the 1950s, I think, that two trends happen that start to push Avon more and more into African American neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods. One is that it becomes much more international, moving into Latin America, into Cuba, Puerto Rico, Mexico, Brazil, just to name a few. And so there's a sense that they're going to be using their products in a more diverse customer and representative staff. And at the same time, they finally get onto the civil rights bandwagon in the 1960s. I give them a lot of credit. In the 1960s and with affirmative action in the 1970s, they're serious about it. They stumble, they make a lot of mistakes, they say things that we look at now and are very cringy, but they're much more earnest than I think a lot of American companies might have been, about increasing represented African Americans in not just the representative staff, but in the corporation as well. I don't go into this too much. The archives at the it just didn't quite fit in the same parameters of what I was looking at. But certainly where African Americans are working for Avon tends to be in those distribution plants and in the manufacturing. And so Avon tries very hard to, count them. How many, where are they working? What are their pay rates? And so it's both an internal company decision as well as an attempt to reach out to more representatives in the 1960s and 70s.
At the same time that the company was doing outreach to the African American community, were they doing any sort of outreach to Latino or Asian American communities too,
Within the United States?
or
Um,
globally?
yeah, I mean, worldwide, certainly. Within the United States, I'm just not as familiar with it. The 1970s and 80s, a lot of that has to be read through advertising, because the nature of the archive changes when you get, especially as you get towards the 1980s. The corporation saves much less. So it's harder to see motivations behind the scenes. It's harder to find drafts of, how the company is thinking about making a public statement, how they might change their language. So a lot of it has to be read through advertising. And just as a historian, I'm uncomfortable using advertising as a solid piece of evidence of what a company is thinking, if you know what I mean. So again, I have to, in terms of the American domestic market, 1960s and 70s, race in all of their literature is really defined as black and white, right? You are African American or you are white. And so these other ethnicities and these other kind of experiences are just totally under the radar, like they're not asked about in different surveys from the 1970s and 80s.
But throughout this period, through the 80s, the company is growing.
Absolutely. Mostly international. And there's other historians who talk about the international growth of Avon, but it's domestic. I'd have to go back and look. I don't like making these grand statements about it, but like their American representative staff, I think peaks around the 1980s. You're just not going to see it growing by leaps and bounds as the company did in the 1930s and 40s and 50s. It levels out. So Avon's reach internationally grows exponentially after the 1970s.
And their growth, at least in the United States, seemed like it tied in very well. The company grew whenever there was a recession on.
Yeah, that's true for a lot of direct sales companies. Kind of right now we call it the gig market, but people looking for something to do, a way to bring in extra cash. So Avon's also part of a much bigger conversation about direct sales, as well as being this kind of internal company.
So in addition to more people being willing to turn to that sort of work at a time when the economy is less than great, is it also a case of more people looking to buy something like that? Since I know Avon, yeah, just remembering some of what my mother bought over the years, it wasn't always the best in the world, but for what you got, it was pretty good.
Yeah, I think they tried very hard to keep that reputation of quality products. They would try to innovate with different products, different skincare routines and whatnot. But certainly direct sales relies a bit on kind of emotional marketing of, I need shampoo, here's my friend, she's trying to sell it, I'll buy it from her, as opposed to what might be in the store, a more anonymous sale. And so direct selling as a whole does that. I wonder if during times of financial stress that comes into play. I remember a couple stories from the 1930s of neighbors saying that they would buy a lipstick because for 7 cents you could have something pretty and your friend would be happy and feel like she had accomplished something as well. So that's what I mean by kind of the emotional work of consumerism that direct sales plays on. It's not sustainable for a lot of people. Getting those first sales is fine, but it's hard to keep buying, to keep going back if there's other options. But like you said, Avon tried very hard to make sure that people were delivered something decent.
Yeah, that also kind of got my gears turning a bit. Was from I think it was the early 1940s, with cities being divided up into territories, and that each territory was 400 households. That, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems like a really small area to try to make a
Oh,
living out of.
if you actually tried to go to them, it would be very difficult, I bet. What could you go to in a day? Maybe 30 if you were working all day at it. You need 10, 15 minutes in between. So say you can get to 3, even if you went to 3 households for 10 minutes, and you did it 8, so that's 24, 25 a day. Maybe you could. Fuller Brush did that. Fuller Brush broke people up into territories. Their sales managers would get 3 or 4 of them into a car, and they would drop the men off at blocks. And here you kind of need suburban marketplace, and say you have this street, and this street. I'm going to pick you up at noon. You have to distribute these pamphlets. You have to, see how many orders you get. They played all sorts of games of who could get orders. For an Avon lady, she kind of had that territory, but no one was dropping her off. Avon recognized that most of them would work just a few hours a week. Vast majority of Avon ladies are not working anywhere close to, multiple hours a day. They kind of call their friends, they kind of see people, they knocked on some doors, but what the company found is that very few would even try to cover everyone in that neighborhood. So that's again the important thing here, is that this is not a job that Avon is monitoring anyone by. It's just by, how big is the order that you can put in at the end of 2 weeks or 3 weeks. And so that 400 person territory was meant to kind of restrict her, but think of all the assumptions that are embedded in that. Your family lives near there. True? Not so true, especially not in the 1950s and 60s where people are on the move. And some people are looking at Avon as a way to meet new neighbors, to meet new people. Tupperware made a grand effort in this with their home parties where you invited your neighbors to come to your house. It was much more efficient. But Avon ladies tended to work for a very short time. And part of it might have been that notion that you're supposed to be going around to these strangers and knocking on their door and trying to solicit orders. And they just really didn't. They just didn't. They didn't do the thing. And so the 400 person territory, I guess it's in the eye of the beholder. You thought it would be too small. And here I am thinking there's no way she's going to go and try to find 400 people. 400 households. I guess that would be a couple thousand people.
Yeah, or even more.
Yeah.
Average number of children being much higher at mid-century.
Right. Right. Depending on
So,
the neighborhood you're in. Yep.
so before we chronologically move into the 1990s, I think we should have a sidebar here about the name change of the company from California Perfume to Avon. When, how, and why?
The story that I tell in the book, I know that in the 1930s, there had been an effort to start thinking about the removing the geographic reference to California because the company was not in California. I mean, they had representatives there, but the company was not in California. And perfume was very limited in terms of their product line. And so perfume that was meant to be exotic or to sound expensive, here comes the Depression, and perfume is not what people are looking for. And so there had been an effort to change both of those elements of the name. Avon had come up, folklore about McConnell and Stratford upon Avon, and thinking that the hills in Avon, England, look like the hills of Suffern. I don't know. I'm not sentimental enough to know if that's true. But once it was decided that Avon, the brand name of the cosmetic line, would become the name of the company, I really appreciate the story of Leela Eastman, who was the traveling agent turned city manager of Pasadena. Really remarkable woman who, taking out radio ads all by herself and on her office budget to say, look for your Avon lady. Suggested it was pretty drop of a hat and that most people didn't even realize the connection between the old California Perfume Company and the new Avon corporation, but that by reusing a brand name rather than a product name kind of opened up a whole new line of customers and people seeking a representative for this particular product line. But I guess it's one of the brainchilds too of the young McConnell in kind of modernizing the California Perfume Company into that kind of mid 20th century place.
So as we're working through our sort of overview of the company's history, I believe we were about to get into the 1990s.
Right.
So that's a time of crisis.
It was a time of crisis. Time of growth too. I think they really thought that they would still be on that rocket ride. The rest of the US economy is on a bit of a rocket ride in the 1990s. Avon had tried to diversify, become a conglomerate into many different types of businesses. That didn't work so well. It was certainly on the radar, especially as the conversation about women in business became much more public, much more pervasive. Avon really believed it had a role to play, that its voice was important for a kind of a large conversation about women in business, kind of unabashedly feminist at that point, and rewarded as such. Working Women Magazine, Catalyst, others naming Avon as one of the top corporations for women to work for in the United States. And it consistently got that top 10 ranking throughout the 1990s. And so it was really riding its laurels a lot at that point. Huge name recognition all of this, of the company, all kind of the problems and stumbles that it had, to say anything other than in the 1980s and 90s that this company was on an upward trajectory. Even when I was there in the 1990s and someone had called it a Fortune 500 company, they were quickly corrected. This is a Fortune 250 company. Thank you. This is, this was no small potatoes. And so I think they believed they had a lot of clout, and I do give them credit. It's so hard as a historian and writing kind of a history of women in business and their relationships to corporations, and certainly recognizing all those issues. But I do give Avon an awful lot of credit for elevating a national conversation about women, about where they belong in business, about what they can do with business, kind of clear-eyed about the challenges that women face in starting businesses, not just within Avon or as an Avon representative, but in the world at large. And so they played that role. They were very conscious of playing that role in the 1990s.
But still, it takes until
Yeah.
uh,
Yep.
well into the 90s to get a woman in the C-suite.
Yeah, 1998, 99. Yeah, there's a put your money where your mouth is, but like, careful, not too quickly. It's yeah, like I say, Avon had. It is a complex company. I guess that's how you started this conversation with too. It's not seamless. It's complex, and certainly their relationship to the path to Andrea Young was fraught by its board as well. And they lost women leaders in those moments too, in those key years where women were waiting in the wings and not being chosen, and took their talents elsewhere out of Avon. So yeah, an interesting place, I think.
Certainly, because then as we get into the 2000s, there's the collapse of the direct sales.
Yeah, industry wide. There's still I haven't looked, but if there were fewer than 2,000 direct sales companies in the United States today, I'd be surprised. Still a lot of companies that will start off with direct sales, but they all took a hit. And I think that when Avon was looking at Andrea Young, they were looking at her as someone who, with a marketing background, that was again going to elevate Avon out of that cringeworthy, ding dong Avon Calling and thinking of, one's grandmother at the door, to something that would be very modern, very chic, very elegant. And the company just could not balance that conversation of, wanting to be a modern, chic company with what do we do with this 100 and some year commitment to representatives and women business owners. And so I think for a long time, and Andrea Young did this, was simply try to keep both conversations going, but they could not sustain each other. And in fact, they ended up tearing each other apart. And then of course, the other thing that Avon just cannot navigate is that, hundreds of thousands of independent representatives and the internet, how to set them up websites, how people can go online and order Avon and somehow get it through a woman who might be living a couple blocks away. Like they just could not navigate that change.
Was that at all complicated with this change happening roughly at about the same time as the first .com crash, give or take a couple of years?
Yeah, I guess it would have been. I've never put the two together. I guess so.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about the period of perhaps overconfidence, immediately preceding the crash.
Yeah. Oh, that could very well be.
Then I know we're doing some history very much just barely over our shoulders, but how about the 2000s and the 20 teens?
For Avon,
Yeah.
uh, I'm really kind of, I hate to say it, but I'm just really out of my league on that one. I mean, the historical archives just, if they've even been transferred to Hagley, I can't imagine that they're available. I could be wrong, but corporations are much more litigious now and look at those archives as much potential problems as a potential source of pride of their history. And so I'm not sure where Avon was, other than what we can read in the papers. Andrea Young was under an enormous amount of pressure. She was not performing the way that the shareholders and the board expected. When she was let go, the company, I believe, went through two more CEOs, also drawn from within, women drawn from within. And then when the company was sold and moved over to London, from what I understand, they spun off the Avon USA, and so Avon USA is still operating, and Avon ladies today are working for Avon USA as opposed to the Avon products that comes out of London, and that has since, of course, been even diversified farther afield than that.
And if we could have a little conversation about some of your finds in the archive. I'm curious if you found anything that really stood out as your favorite, or maybe even if there was something that you thought personally was especially compelling, but there just wasn't room for in your book.
Oh gosh, almost everything got in there. There's so many images. I think for me personally, no, it's not personal. It's just part of my personal interest. It's not me. There's no family history connection to Avon other than what the little lipstick samples that my mom brought home. But it's just the pictures. The early Avon literature is filled with a lot of pictures that representatives and traveling agents took on themselves to send in, as if McConnell would personally be interested in seeing them there with their sample books. The women who often got dressed up and posed, who clearly went into studios, photography studios, with their finest dress and carrying their sample case and their book, or maybe riding their bicycle, a pen in hand to show that they were business women. I was able to include a lot of these types of images in the book. I mean, really about a dozen or so, but there are so many. There are so many women who went out of their way to take those pictures to show that they were in business. And you do get that sense of empowerment, that sense that they were doing it because they were incredibly proud of what they were doing, that they liked this relationship that they had with the company, that it was bringing them a measure of control or a measure of power, that they could have a savings, that they could do something for their family. I just found them to be the most delightful parts of the archive. Later, you get all the corporate images, you get the staged models, and it just doesn't have that feel to it that the early part did. There was a couple of memoirs of women who took time to write kind of their histories with it. The one that's just a diary of Louise Fogarty, who was the traveling agent as a young woman, traveling for a few years. Again, very delightful. I like when business history any history really, but can kind of get down to that granular sense of like feeling that these were real people. And I think that's what maybe why I shied away a little bit, especially from the much later parts of the history, where, like I said, those stock photos, they're charming, they're interesting, they're filled with symbolism, but I like the real people.
How about the poem?
The poem, yes. Oh God. A friend of mine noted that there's a lot in corporate archives that's just a lot of bad poetry. And how much could we find of people who took time to write a poem about, it was to her husband, right? I don't have
Yes.
time. Don't have time. Gotta do my Avon.
All right. Sorry, I'm just rounding up through my questions. I think we're getting about, yes, we're at the end of what I'd had written down. Is there anything I haven't asked you today that you wish I had or that you were really excited to discuss?
Oh, no, probably think of something a little bit later, but no, this was fun. It was fun to talk about, to remember um, for this book. It does cover quite a bit. Sometimes I kind of surprised how much the length of it, that of time that Avon took.
Well, that if I might leave us with one last final question for real, then is for someone who reads your book, what is the like biggest picture takeaway that you would want someone who reads your book to have?
Hmm. Uh, it has to be about women and their experience of business, um, and how the structure of business matters, not just, I guess, to everybody, but to women as well. And so to think about that women in business can both be describing people who are working in a corporation, working at middle management, working at, ways of working up and developing new talents in the interest of a corporation. But that women at, what we call the kitchen table entrepreneurship, that the level of um, women who want to work and to have a business, of what language that means, right? What that takes to shape that experience of owning a business. Without going back too far, because I know we're just trying to wrap this up, I was thinking of the 1980s when Avon looked at women owning actual independent businesses. That the safety, that what that experiment highlighted was that women who worked for Avon and as Avon representatives had so many business decisions already made for them, right? The products were made, the distribution was made, the advertising campaigns were there, the pricing structure was already set for them. And so even that entrepreneurship of Avon ladies as business owners was very circumscribed. And so I think that's just important to keep in mind for when we talk about people in business and women in business, is to always bear in mind that the structure of the business that they're in um, really shapes their experience and shapes their opportunities.
I think that's a good note to end things on.
Thank
Uh,
you.
Thank you very much for sitting down with us today. And for more Hagley History Hangouts and more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society, you can visit us online at www.hagley.org. And thank you again, Dr. Manko.
Thank you very much.